Oh, hello, world. Welcome to Comic Book News. I'm your old pal, Dan Shaheen. Got a really exciting show for you today. Man, two shows, two great interviews about underground comics in 1 week. Amazing. Both guests had mega technical difficulties getting started, but we were able to troubleshoot and surmount them all, including myself. Actually, I had incredible technical difficulties. But before we get into that, a little bit of pre-show biz. Thanks for watching this show. If you want to see your comics on this show, on the $1 Million Mailbox, there's just one place to send them. That's the $1 Million Mailbox, P.O. Box 1163, Arcata, California, 95518. You send them to me. Me and my pal Larry Young will spread them out on the $1 Million Comics Cam and give you our unvarnished opinion on them. So make sure to send those in. Okay. Earlier this week, we talked to Brian Doherty, and he wrote the book Dirty Pictures, how an underground network of nerds, feminists, misfits, geniuses, bikers, potheads, printers, intellectuals, and art school rebels revolutionized art and invented comics. And we're talking to one of these guys today. I don't know how many of those adjectives or descriptors he checks off, but we'll find out in just a minute. We're going to talk to Denis Kitchen all about his amazing career in comics. When I first knew about Kitchen Sink Press, it was probably the Spirit reprints that he put out in the 80s. That's where I remember seeing that name, Kitchen Sink, and it having it immediately associated with super high quality comics. It wasn't until later I found out his rich history in the undergrounds and as a cartoonist himself, not to mention as a publisher, not to mention now as an artist representative, agent to the comics superstars. So we'll talk to him in just a minute, but where do we do that? We can't do it here. We got to take it somewhere a little more dignified and appropriate for a guest of such stature.
For the bat pulse.
Okay, we got it in the Bat Cave. So let's bring in our guest right now. Denis Kitchen, hey, welcome to Comic Book News.
Hey, Dan. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks for making it. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
No, we overcame them.
Yeah, you did it like a champ. I'm just gonna say you took right to the task and took care of business. But you're no stranger to solving difficult problems. I think that's true. I read about you. I just read a lot about your history in Brian Doherty's great book, and he told me what a tremendous resource you were to him in helping compile that info, and how you had made all of your letters and correspondence and stuff available at a university to him. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Let's talk a little bit about that book and that process.
Well, Brian certainly did his homework. I was impressed. I haven't finished the book yet. I've got a bookmark about a third of the way through, but so far I'm really enjoying it, and I haven't caught any significant error.
My favorite part is probably part you haven't read yet. It's the part where you buy a Ferrari.
Oh, he talks about that. Well, now people see your listeners are going to think I'm some kind of rich hippie, but that was tied into my deal moving out here and joining forces with Kevin Eastman. So we're jumping ahead a bit, but
yeah, right.
He ended up buying a hair over 50% of Kitchen Sink, and in part of the payment, he explained to me he had, because Kevin was very rich, he had bought a exotic car dealer, and he had something like, I want to say, 40 Ferraris. So he said, Ferrari's going to be part of the deal. But what am I going to say? No?
That is fantastic. That he didn't say in the book.
So I drove it a few times. I was always paranoid about parking it somewhere, and and I got rid of it eventually. I do like weird cars, but not necessarily fancy exotic cars.
Okay.
But now we're off topic.
Well, no, it doesn't surprise me to hear that you like weird anything, right? Because you liked weird comics back before weird comics were really fully embraced by the mainstream. I see you going back to 1969 with Mom's Homemade Comics.
Hey, people are going to think I'm old now, Dan. But yes, it started in the late 60s.
So tell me a little bit about Mom.
Yeah. Well, it started out really, I was attending college at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and I co-founded the college's first satire magazine called Snide. And we put out the first issue, and the next semester I was a senior. I was going to take it over, and it was going to be an all comic book issue. But the editor the previous year had absconded with our treasury, went off to Mexico and bought pot, and never saw him again. So without a treasury, there was no more Snide, but I'd already started the comic, and I decided, what the heck, I'm going to self-publish it. So I did it, and that ended up being Mom's Homemade Comics #1, which was intended really for a local audience. It had a lot of Milwaukee and Midwest kind of references. And I printed 4,000 because that's how much money I had. I went to a local printer and he said, how much money, what's your budget? I told him what I had, and he said, I can print 4,000. So it was an arbitrary number, and I didn't have a clue how I was going to sell them. So I had the wherewithal and the energy and the chutzpah to literally start walking around to every head shop, used bookstore, my friendly corner druggist, you name it. And they would let me put a pile on the counter on consignment. And that summer of 1969, I went back to probably 20, 30 outlets numerous times. And by the end of summer, I had sold 3,000 copies. Amazing. Just on the east side of Milwaukee, which still amazes me looking back, because a lot of books today don't sell 3,000 in the whole country.
Totally.
But it was different then. There was a very hungry market. I and my audience pretty much looked like you know, you could recognize them. They were hippies, and hippies were hungry for their own literature. And you had basically underground newspapers in most major cities and college towns, but those were regional. But the comics, certainly not counting Mom's was local, but the comics were the glue that kind of held the whole tribe together nationally. And I mean, you got to throw in Canada, parts of Europe too. And so you have to put yourself in the perspective of, it wasn't like you go to a comic shop and there are thousands of choices. There weren't comic shops when I started. There was no internet when I started. We're talking more primitive times where you wanted comics, you had to go probably to a drugstore with a spinner rack, or if you were lucky, you know, some periodical dealer who had a good selection, but it wasn't easy. And so underground comics were distributed via head shops. And they, like us, were kind of an outlaw set of entrepreneurs, long-haired people with enough business sense to at least start a business and maybe keep it. And those were kindred spirits. They would carry the comics. Some of them were quite knowledgeable. For some of them, they were just widgets, and they'd order, you know, give me a dozen of each or whatever. But the smart ones knew that somebody like Crumb would sell better, or the Freak Brothers would sell better. And so it was a network that was a lot stronger than people might think. It was so strong that we could print 10,000 of almost anything and sell it within certainly a year or less. And the good ones we'd reprint over and over and over again. And sometimes you'd hit 6 figures in total circulation.
How many of those head shops in that network would you say there were roughly at that time?
You know, honestly, I don't think we ever counted, and it's not like any of us had a complete list. Our mailing lists also included, like, you know, used bookstores and places that wouldn't be easy to categorize. But I would say certainly there must have been easily 1,000, 2,000, easily, and possibly more, because the big cities had a lot. And you know, I mean, I might have 1 or 2, say, good head shops in Minneapolis, but there might have been a half a dozen or 8 or 10. I don't know.
That's what I'm trying to make it analogous to say what the direct market comics shops number
you
is.
know, it was the
It's right in that area.
Precursor.
Yes,
it was definitely the precursor, because Phil Suling, you may know, started the direct market, but Phil started by distributing underground comics, as well as being the guy who basically started the comic conventions.
Yes.
And so basically what Phil modeled his direct market system after was the fact that we would go to a shop directly and we could offer a 50% discount, and we could go to a distributor and offer a 60% discount, but only if it was on a non-returnable basis.
Yes.
Regular comics, as you probably know, were sold on newsstands on a returnable basis. So they drop off the latest Spider-Man and Superman, and a month later or whatever, they would come back, take the unsold ones and stuff new ones in the spinner rack. And so as a result, it was a very inefficient system. As many as 50%, sometimes more, would be returned and ultimately pulped and destroyed. So in our case, it was efficiency. We couldn't deal with returns, but it also turns out to be a much more environmentally friendly system, because if you ship 10,000 comics, you don't have to get 5,000 back and destroy them. So yeah, there were times when there was no system and no role model, so we had to invent it ourselves. And if it worked, we kept it. If it didn't, we didn't.
So you definitely agree with like a Bob Beerbaum. I don't know if you know Bob.
I know Bob.
Yeah, and he is firmly in that camp that it was the undergrounds that inspired Phil Suling to create the direct market with the terms that he did. Also, Bob has talked, and others have talked about how your creation of Comics Book was one of the first time, if not the first time, that creators publishing something ostensibly through Marvel would get to retain their copyrights if they had them already. You sort of had a hybrid deal on
it did. It started out, and then Stan and I were debating the whole time about it, because I don't know how many of your listeners know, but Stan and I were unlikely friends. I sent him the first Moms just on a lark, and got a nice letter from him back, and we ended up being pen pals. And he was intrigued by what I was doing and what the undergrounds in general were. And at that time, Stan had just taken over the publisher role from Martin Goodman, who had retired. So Stan suddenly had the authority to authorize something like Comics Book, but it didn't happen overnight. He actually tried to get me to come to New York and work in the bullpen and be an editor, and that didn't appeal to me.
Wow.
On one level, it did. I was a Marvel fan, and on one level, it was like, wow, that could be like an amazing job. But because I already had my own company and was doing my own thing, and I was in charge, that was far more appealing. I also didn't like the idea of moving to New York City. I didn't like that idea. And so we ended up compromising. After months of back and forth, we agreed that I could stay in Wisconsin, but he would pay me a New York salary and save the office space. And what he didn't know was I could continue to run Crumb and Kitchen Sink at a time when the undergrounds were in kind of a crisis mode in 1973 for other complicated reasons.
Yeah.
So yeah, we helped each other. And Stan was looking for street cred, because at that time he was a middle-aged guy who was suddenly getting a lot of attention because Marvel was seen as a phenomenon, mainly on college campuses, where he was touring, giving talks. And I think he saw the popularity of undergrounds, and he realized that the kind of comics Marvel was doing were not reaching that full audience, and he thought I could help him. That was the premise. What he didn't realize, it also opened a Pandora's box that he couldn't shut.
Well, speaking of which, what can we take a look at comics book right now? Do you mind if we take a look?
Do you have examples? Yeah.
I think I might have one somewhere in something that we call the $1 Million Comics Cam. Hang on, I've got dirty pictures right here. Wait a minute, let's get this going. I got dirty pictures here. I can't recommend this book enough. You should all go out and check it out. And then I've got comics book 1 through 4 right here, Dennis. So we absolutely
All right.
can.
Well, you are well prepared.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So that first cover by Pete Poplaski, the idea is that we're upending the usual Marvel genre, which is, an adventure comic that has, a hero saving some poor damsel in distress and some monster attacking. And basically we're saying, fuck that. What I always hated about that cover, because I didn't have a chance to see printer proofs, is that blue shadow from the knife is supposed to be over the line. In other words, Pete drew that complete character, and some technician at Marvel thought the blue was supposed to obliterate it. So I always hated that. It doesn't look like a shadow.
In the book, it mentioned that maybe it was put to cover like a cigar or a cigarette or something in the artist's mouth. Is that not right? It was just a technical
that doesn't make sense to me. I don't know who came up with that theory. I think it was just a technical error.
Okay, I thought I saw that. I believe it is in this book, but not a quote from you, but from somebody else, I think.
Oh, okay.
So immediately we open this up, and we see Stan Lee is listed here as. Oops, wait a minute. As
at the very top, isn't it?
Yeah, let me zoom in here on the as the instigator, right? And
there's a funny story behind that, actually. You want to digress for a minute?
Please, this is your time for sure.
Well, so Stan was. I had the first issue completely done, and in those days it was a paste up, literally a paste up, where the type you're looking at was typed on a kind of a machine we had, and then with hot wax you'd paste it down and use the T-square to get it straight. It's unimaginable to the digital age generation, but it was all done except for Stan's title, because I kept asking him, am I listing you as publisher? Are you editor-in-chief? Who are you? And he said, I'll get back to you. And finally, this was ready to go to press. And I said, Stan, you're holding it up. What's your title? So he said, well, I've been thinking about this. He said, I think you're going to do a good job, and I'm going to get a lot of, great press and credit for it. And so at the same time, he said, you might embarrass me and you might get Marvel in trouble, and I got to keep some distance. So he said, call me instigator. That way, if you get me in trouble, I can say, I just instigated it. But if it does great, I can say, I instigated that. So that was pure Stan.
That is cover your ass, but also hold on to that chance for some glory, right? That is classic Stan. Who's a really interesting guy, because, as you said, he was sort of like already sort of an adult, an older guy in a sort of square world, right? And this was his way to try and get some indie hippie cred.
Exactly.
And while you have some of the greats in here, there were some cartoonists who didn't agree to be in it. Although I will say that, like, Art Spiegelman is in the first 2 issues, dropping the first ever Mouse comics on the world, but then decided later he didn't want to be involved. Is that right?
Yeah, you know what? He didn't like some of the editorial content, and that's fine. Art's tastes are not maybe as pragmatic as comics book had to be. I think in particular, there was an article in the first or second issue about how to modify some kind of a squirt gun. That was a tongue.
I was going to ask you about that. I love that.
Yeah. It was just a tongue-in-cheek thing that I thought was amusing, but Art was like, "What's that doing in an underground comic?" And so, what ultimately he did was he went off with Bill Griffith and started Arcade, which was great because then we had some healthy competition for a while. But the only one who flat out refused was Crumb, because he just didn't like, the idea of working for Marvel. And Jay Lynch, who at first said yes, and then he changed his mind because he was paranoid and he didn't want to sign anything. He was like that his entire life. If you put a contract in front of him, he would freeze. So Jay and Robert were two that I had hoped would be in. But otherwise, there were a lot of other unexpected people like S. Clay Wilson, Justin Green, Kim Deitch, Trina Robbins, Sharon Rudolph, Steve Stiles, Skip Williamson. I mean, I would say just about everybody.
Row of underground cartoonists of that era, for sure.
Yeah. And here's the thing. It was the page rate was 4 times the normal underground page rate. So a lot of starving cartoonists who may have preferred not to work for Marvel still said, "Hey, this will pay my rent a lot faster than, doing the same story for Snarf or Bizarre Sex or something else."
Sure. And Crumb had money rolling in from multiple channels, as well as
I wouldn't say rolling in at that point in his life, but
well, he had the lawsuit, the Keep on Truckin' lawsuit money. That's definitely mentioned in the book. And I wanted to bring this up too. We're going to digress, and I digress with Brian on this. But okay, have you seen this image, Dennis?
Yes.
You know where this comes
that's from the Chip and Dale movie?
From the Chip and Dale movie, yes. So I'm on a mission. He refused to be involved in comics book back then when he could have used the dough. I don't know if he my contention is, and I've been searching all over to find out if the truth is that he was either not asked permission and they were trying to use fair usage under satire and parody, or that he compromised everything he always said he would compromise. He wouldn't compromise to be in a PG rated Disney movie with Mr. Natural, who I'm sorry, doesn't belong in a kid's movie. I don't think a Crumb reference.
Well, I haven't seen the movie, but I know it's a very brief,
super brief, 5 seconds. If
so, I think it's fair use, and I say that because somebody else who did scrutinize the movie carefully said there were no end credits where it says where the other permissions are listed, and so that person thinks automatically he was not asked. I can ask Robert now. I'm curious.
Please.
But I doubt that he would consent to be in a Disney film, even if they waved money at him. It doesn't sound like him.
It doesn't. That's what I'm saying. Everybody else is swearing it had to. Disney would never do it without complete sign off, but I don't believe that's the case. But how ironic is that after the whole Air Pirates saga and everything else? It's amazing.
Yeah. So I would vote fair use.
Okay. One thing that I know Spiegelman specifically and a couple of other cartoonists didn't take to was Howard Cruz's Barefoot's style.
Yeah, those guys all kind of slowly came around. Once I think Howard finally shut them up when he did Stuck Rubber Baby, which is a true classic.
It's a masterpiece.
But it was the Barefoot style. They just didn't they thought it was too cutesy. Now, Howard was trying to make a point with exaggeration, and he was parodying the kind of, I don't know, Miss Peach style of syndicated strip.
Yes.
And if you really read Barefoots, it was very trippy and very clever. And I thought he was brilliant then, and he only became more brilliant. But those guys had a visual tick that they couldn't get rid of over him. And I thought that was their loss. And, so you differ.
Yeah.
This is why you have editors.
Okay. Speaking of visual schisms, it seems to me that the Undergrounds came from kind of 2 major inspirations, one of which being like Mad Magazine, Harvey Kurtzman style, and the others being another EC stuff, like the EC horror stuff. But there was a split amongst the undergrounders who did, like Bill Griffith, I believe, was like, what's going on with all the barbarians and tits and spaceships and stuff going on in these comics?
Right. He actually made a list. He showed me when I stayed with him one night in San Francisco, I think in 75. He explained to me, because remember, I'm in the Midwest and I'm not in the Berkeley, San Francisco era where there is the greatest concentration. And he explained to me the cliques in the Bay Area alone, and then in a larger sense, because he basically said, you're in the Midwest clique with, Jay Lynch and Skip Williamson and Dan Klein and the other Milwaukee guys. And he said, so you don't see this, but he said, we have real cliques out here. And of course, he had the women's clique, and he had the, like you say, the horror based, like Jackson and Rand Holmes and Corbin and people like that. And I forget who else he had. And then I said, well, which clique are you in? Because he and Art Spiegelman and Justin Green and Kim Deitch, a couple others. And he said, oh, we're the pretentious assholes. And I thought that was hilarious, because I love self-deprecating humor. And in that case, it fit totally, because they were pretentious assholes. But, it takes one to know one. And he did categorize it pretty accurately. Oh, there was also the Air Pirates, of course. They had their own category. So, it's a movement, but at the same time, yes, there are movements within the movement.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because I always loved I love Zap. I love the classic undergrounds as well. But like one that never got enough love to me was Slow Death from Last Gasp.
Yep. Some great stuff.
I thought it had a high level of cartooning and also a higher level of accessibility to common people who could read it and get a message that was actually socially positive out of it, while still being able to be wild and crazy with your depictions of all that underground stuff they wanted to show. Really love the book. Here's the squirt gun. I was going to ask you about this, because when I came across this, I was like, this was made for me. Like I loved this.
Well, it was written by Mike Barron, who also was not part of the underground scene. He ended up doing the Badger and Nexus and not Badger. He did Nexus with Steve Rude.
Nexus, yes.
And he lived in Madison, so I knew Mike. He was a friend, and sometimes those are factors when you're assembling something. And he collected squirt guns. He was a squirt gun nut, and he probably literally did this. And the guy who drew the schematic was an artist, Pete Loft, who was very good at drawing schematics. And I just thought, hey, it's not Mechanics Illustrated, but it can take up a couple of pages.
And it's a completely straight, like, telling of why and how, and loving attention to like how well this particular model of squirt gun was made. This just tickled me in every way that it could. So
yeah, but definitely arcane.
And was it a matter of you had 2 pages to fill too, and that it was like text?
Well, sometimes no. I mean, you have to plan issues, but sometimes people are late. You always have to have extra material or filler material.
Great stuff by Justin Green. I think his is probably my favorite stuff of the first 4.
And it wasn't planned this way, but the 5-part Traveliers he did ended up perfectly fitting, because there were only 5 issues. So it would have been awful if it had ended with, say, a chapter to go, or
For sure. No, for sure. It's funny. I came to Justin Green myself through his sign painting comics. I picked up, again, I really like nonfiction stuff and technical drawing and that kind of stuff. So it really appeals to me. And that was the first Justin Green I ever read, was the Sign Game, and I was like,
No
this
kidding.
is amazing, like nothing, like no other comic out there. And honestly, to this day, it's my favorite of his. Rest in peace.
Have you gone back to read Binky Brown Meets the Holy Virgin Mary?
I know I got to go buy that
Yeah.
new. I want to buy that newly redone version of it and give it a good review on the show for sure. Okay, this was issue number 1. We just went through it pretty much in its entirety. What I forgot to ask you about though was, so this is by Stan Lee, and it is kind of Marvel Comics, but it's not. Like the word Marvel is nowhere on this this comic.
If you flip the page where I have the introductory, I think it says "Welcome to Comics Book" or something, or the birth of, the next page. So that's me. That's me telling the origin story.
Great.
And in the second tier there, you see, that's me talking to Stan, and of course I draw Stan looking like J. Jonah Jameson.
And is it true you were a Marvel fan yourself?
Yeah.
And that was part of why you approached Stan and everything else?
Yeah. When I was in college, I mean, I was hooked on the early Marvels starting when I was about 15, I think. And so, I mean, some of your readers might appreciate when I was in college and the very earliest Spider-Man and Fantastic Four were coming out, I would go to the drugstore near campus and I would buy 5 copies of each. I would stack 4 mint and read one over and over. And I did that for a couple of years. So I had multiple copies of probably Fantastic Four starting around issue 10 and Spider-Man right from the beginning. And so that's how I really financed Kitchen Sink. When I needed working capital, no bank was going to give a long-haired hippie any money. So I sold my comic collection way prematurely because some of those comics now are going for 12, 15,000 each in mint condition. I was selling them for 1 and 200 and thinking it was obscene profits because I paid a dime for them. So,
well, you would have regretted it if you sold them any point between then and now, because that market has exploded. But let's not be too sad about Denis Kitchen, because who was it? Brian Doherty was saying how much original Crumb artwork and original, say, Robert Williams artwork or whatever. Do you collect that stuff? Do you have a lot of it?
I do.
Did you sell that stuff?
Well, I occasionally do, and at some point, I think my wife will say, "I don't want it, so do something with it before you get hit by a bus." So it's on the to-do list, Dan.
Okay, I'll bet you'll be able to find a buyer for that when you need it. But every minute you're hanging on to them, they're only appreciating insanely. Isn't it? It's kind of a double-edged thing, because it's like the value of these things now has grown, not due to fans that appreciate it. It's due to like hedge funds and money managers getting involved with that side of things. You got any thoughts or feelings about that, good or ill?
Not at the moment. I don't know. No.
Well, not till you sell your stuff.
But to go back to that origin story again, you might even look at that panel if you can get a close-up on it.
Yeah.
Where I'm making fun of the whole fact that I'm doing business with Marvel. So if you read the exchange I have with Stan, I don't know if you can get a close-up on that.
Let's see.
Maybe you can read it out loud. It's too small for me.
Okay, it says, but Stan, I'll read it off the page. But Stan, these other comics appeal to pimply-faced, moronic adolescents. Enough said, Dan. You want to appeal to intellectuals. No, I want to appeal to pimply-faced, moronic adults.
So, again, I hope it comes across. I'm showing that I'm a little bit uncomfortable myself, having made this compromise with a big company. And so I'm having fun with it at his expense and mine. So
okay. And when the project ultimately ended, didn't continue, you continued comics book. Did you self-publish it or seek another?
Well, Marvel published 3 issues. When he was getting feedback, I'm told from other sources that people in the New York office, like the bullpen artists, saw this, and they saw that the art was coming back and that I had actually negotiated to keep the copyrights as well. And basically, I think they, went into Stan's office and said, "Why the hell are you giving these hippies a better deal than you're giving us?"
Yeah.
And Stan didn't have an answer. He had, and I'll never figure this out, he hadn't thought the next step. He must have thought that whatever deal he made with me would stay secret and nobody would talk. But of course, cartoonists talk. And of course, our deal is our deal. So he got into trouble with other staffers and he didn't have a quick fix. And so the easiest thing was to kill the book. Now, that's not to say sales might have been disappointing. I never saw final sales numbers. He did tell me they printed 200,000 of each. And I have notes somewhere that I think the first issue had a 40% sell through. So they sold 80,000. And I think the goal was to sell at least 100,000. So it could be it just didn't sell enough. But it certainly was political too. And so what was really great about Stan, he was such a gentleman, was he said, "Okay, you got 2 issues in the can. I'm not going to publish them. You can do them yourself." And he just allowed me to. And he had already paid the artists. So, and he didn't even really fire me. He said, "Hey, we'd like to keep you on and have you edit Crazy Magazine. How about it then?" And I think I actually thought about it for a day or two because the money was good. I was in central Wisconsin living on a New York City, salary, which at that time was nice. And so I thought about it and I said, well, Crazy is an imitation of Mad. And I said, I've got some ideas on how to shake it up and bring some new artists in. I think, I might consider that. And he said, whoa, stop right there. He said, "You're not going to change the formula. It's a copy of Mad. That's the way we like it. We sell 10% of what Mad does, and it's very profitable. Don't shake it up. Just need someone to basically put it together." And I said, well, in that case, no, it doesn't interest me. And so we parted on friendly terms. And that was that. So that was a big fork in the road. And the fork I stayed on, for better or worse, was the Undergrounds.
Explain this to me. Was comics book, though, was it distributed via newsstands, returnable?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think that's a key reason why it could never quite perform like an Underground, which were available as perennial items, where this thing would have just disappeared after a month, right?
Yep, so exactly.
That's really different. And that's great. They would kill for 80,000 sales on anything.
Today, but then
this day and age,
their expectations were higher then.
Sure.
But I don't know what their break even was either. It was hard to get that kind of information. There was no transparency.
And no ads in this thing too. So that changes the break even point. And
exactly.
Right. Okay. So let's move on from there. So after that, you realize the Undergrounds are kind of going away, or that thing is not happening as much. And you shifted into, tell me what you shifted. What was your thinking and how did you change the business model of KSP and Crumb?
Well, in 1971, I met Will Eisner at Phil Seuling's New York convention and we hit it off. And so I asked him about reprinting The Spirit because I hadn't seen very many, but I had seen one printed in Harvey Kurtzman's Help magazine. And I think I had seen the Harvey reprinted it in 66 and I had bought those. And so I loved what I saw. And I said, why don't you let me reprint those? And Will said, he knew I was selling to a young long-haired audience. And he said, why would they be interested in something that was done 25 years ago? And I said, well, I can only say I appreciate it. And I don't like just comics by my peers. I just like good comics. So I'm willing to take the risk. And he basically said, well, all right, it's your money. He said, I'll license it to you. So I think that was in 72, the first underground, we call it the Underground Spirit because he did kind of a naughty cover. And I think inside too, there was, some bare breasts or something that Will normally wouldn't have done, but he could get away with. And then I did a second issue that was similar. And at that point, Jim Warren saw them. And he had always been a fan of Will's also. And he talked to Will and he said, how many is that kid in Wisconsin selling? And Will said, oh, the second issue sold 20,000 copies. Wow. And Warren said, I can sell 100,000. Come with me. And so at that point, they put together a deal for the newsstand magazine. And I couldn't compete with that because while my system was more efficient, it would take a long time, forever, to approach six figures. So Will said, no hard feelings, Dennis. I can't turn down this opportunity, but he said, I'm sure we'll do business again. And so he required as a condition of doing business with Warren that Warren buy my remaining backstock of Spirit. So I was whole. And then 16 issues later, he and Warren came to a decision to not continue. And I think that was partly sales were diminishing and partly Jim Warren's not the easiest guy to get along with. And at that point,
but again, that was newsstand distribution.
For the magazine, absolutely. Yeah.
Versus direct market distribution for your comic.
Direct market and still the residual head shop market, which I had I had a division called Crumb distribution up until 1980. So that was the cutoff at a point when there really weren't enough head shops and alternative outlets to make that distribution arm make sense. So for me, it was always actually three-pronged because besides the direct market, my own Crumb distribution, there was also, I had a mail order company. So we would sell direct to consumer as well.
Yeah, you've had your fingers in almost every level of the industry, except maybe retailing. But no, you went direct to consumer too. So
I had a head shop in Milwaukee, and we sold newsstand comics there. So technically, I was a retailer too. So yeah, that means, actually, you're right. I don't know if there's anyone else who was a cartoonist, publisher, distributor, retailer at the same time.
The only thing I won close to Steve Jeppy, but he was never a cartoonist. He's been a guest on my show too.
Yeah, well, I mean, a dubious distinction, but maybe.
That's like the EGOT. That the EGOT concept, the Emmy, Grammy, Oscar, Tony,
yes,
right. So you whatever that acronym would be, you've been the publisher, retailer, distributor, an artist, you're Prad, which is amazing, and makes you the perfect guest for this show because I know you've probably never seen my show before, but I've interviewed Steve Jeppy and Chuck Rosansky and a bunch of guys like that.
Oh, okay. Well, I am curious to see more now, Dan. Absolutely. And
cool. Thank you. I appreciate that. So wait a minute. One last topic before we get you out of here. We touched on it in the beginning when I tipped my hand about the Ferrari, but let's talk a little bit about the kitchen sink Tundra merger era, because I mean, that was an amazing company, comics company, the likes of which we're not likely to see again. All that kind of money being thrown at whatever the artist wanted, producing masterpieces like From Hell. That's the top of my list as far as what's one of my all-time favorite comics. So just tell me a little bit about how that deal came to be, what you made, and what happened.
Well, you have to start at the very beginning of this, which is when Kevin was, I think, 17 or 18, before the Turtles. He twice sent submissions to Kitchen Sink Press. He, they came over the transom like a lot of other things. In those days, I always tried to give a personal response to people who submitted, even if it was fairly brief. And 90% of the time, things were inappropriate and rejected, but I hated to just send a form letter. So I think I sent him an encouraging handwritten note or two. Then years later, after his Big Turtle success, I ran into him at a convention, probably in the early 90s. And he came over to me and he said, "Hey, man, I just wanted to thank you." He said, "When I was a total unknown, I sent submissions to everybody in the business, and you were the only one who ever wrote back." And he said, "I really appreciated that." And I thought, wow, it was nice of you to say. I didn't realize, other people weren't being as kind, but I get it.
You're like, I wasted all this time writing letters to people.
Yeah. So flash forward another couple of years or so, I think 93, he called me one winter day when I was in Wisconsin, and I was watching a Packer game with my friends on a Sunday afternoon, and that's the state religion, of course. And the phone rang, and I remember turning to a couple of friends and saying, "Who would call in the middle of the Packer game?" Well, it was Kevin. And that was totally unexpected. And, it was like, "Hey, what's up?" And hemming and hawing. And finally, he just cut to the point and he said, "I've got a proposition for you." And he said, "It's going to be either your dream come true or your worst nightmare." But he said, "I think if we put our companies together, it could be amazing." And all I heard was dream come true, because I was always severely undercapitalized. And he had plenty of money, but
He's
was
swimming in Ferraris over here.
Yeah, swimming in Ferraris. And so, make a long story short, we got together and we explored it. And then, without doing any real due diligence and really thinking it through, we fairly quickly put together a deal. And, on paper, it probably looked good, but it only lasted a few years, and it ended with the death of Kitchen Sink. So it's hard to summarize in a few minutes, other than I thought it was worth the gamble. And I still think Kevin's a great guy. I don't think that of a lot of his lieutenants who were involved. But, it was an experiment that just didn't work. And also the timing was not great, because it happened at a time when the comics industry went through one of its periodic, downsides. And so when you're starting something and it's already complicated, and then the market starts shrinking at the same time, it throws a wrench in all of your projections. And so that's something for a separate hour, Dan.
Sure. I hope you will come back maybe, and we can talk about it. I would love to talk like just about Tundra for like a long time, because it's such amazing stuff that came out there.
Yep.
And getting to work with the likes of Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell and whoever else, that could have been pretty fun too, I would
think. Absolutely.
Okay. I know that you have some pressing engagements. So since you just pretty much promised that you'll come back and talk to me, and you basically just committed to it.
Sure.
Maybe we'll bring you back again in the not too distant future and talk about, honestly, whatever you want to talk about. But what I want to know is, after Kitchen Sink, and we can just wrap it up here, was that when you went into artist representation?
Yeah, I think
an agent.
After Kitchen Sink went under at the beginning of 1999, I was kind of depressed and didn't know what I was going to do next. And then Will Eisner called me and he said, "Dennis, would you be my agent?" And I said, "Will, you're your own agent. You're a businessman. You don't need me to help you with that. You do it all yourself." And he said, "Yes, I know that." But he said, "It takes time." And he said, "You can do it. and I'll have more time to draw. And he said, the sands are falling through my hourglass, and I want to draw as much as possible, and you can help me create more. And so how could I say no to that?
No, you can't. You can't.
And then once I said yes to that, then there were other opportunities, and I started handling the Eisners. I mean, the Harvey Kurtzman and the Al Cap estate and various others. And
these are titans. These are titans of cartooning that you're talking about.
I've been very lucky to know some giants. Yeah.
Okay, and then you yourself are a cartoonist, and this book came out recently, and
Yeah.
and this was where I was surprised. I didn't realize how much cartooning you actually did. So maybe we wrap it up here where it all began and just your cartooning. Like, is this something you're you still do? Or
well, I'm doing more of it now. Actually, I finally decided to try to come full circle as much as possible. But yeah, I started as a cartoonist. Remember, Moms was a solo book I self-published, and my intent was to find a publisher. And I did briefly. Printmint reprinted Moms #1 and solo printed Moms #2. But I was never happy with them. I didn't think I was getting a fair accounting, and I decided to part with them. And that forced me to self-publish again. And then Jay Lynch and Skip Williamson in Chicago were also unhappy with Printmint. And so they asked me if I would publish their Bijou series as well. And I foolishly said yes, because I didn't know what I was getting into. And that's how I became a publisher. And each time I took on a new project and a new artist, there was less time for me to be at the drawing board. So I never stopped being a cartoonist. It just became part-time.
Okay, well, and I hope now you've got the time to come back to it, because I think your style is so great. I want to say maybe you like Basil Wolverton a little bit. Maybe that's an influence on your style.
Yeah, somebody said I was the bastard child of Basil Wolverton and Ernie Bushmiller.
That's it. That's perfect. All right, that's a perfect note to go out on. Dennis, thank you very much. I got to play some closing credits and stuff. Stick around if you got a couple minutes, but I know you're a busy guy.
You bet.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Dan.
All right. Wow, and thank you for sticking around, folks. That was another great interview all about underground comics. I think that my focus in life as I get older is shifting. It's hard for me to find anything from not just mainstream publishers, but even indie publishers. There's just such a sameness and just such a making intellectual properties as fodder to create films from or something like that, there's not the passion and the grittiness and everything else that comes with underground comics. Luckily, it's not so easy, or not as luckily. It's not that easy to find the underground stuff. So I'm going to be out seeking it out. I'll look at it and talk more about it. The thing that I get the most, though, that I love is the comics that you folks send in for me. So please send in your comics to the $1 Million Mailbox, P.O. Box 1163, Arcata, California, 95518. Now I got to play some closing credits. I'm going to be back on Friday with Serious Star Trek with Larry Young and John Price, PhD, and we'll talk about the new episode of Star Trek. And then I'll be back next week with more something. I don't even know what. I don't know what, but I do know when, and that time will be called next time.